You've spent decades trading your time for a future that always seemed just out of reach. Every morning alarm, every late meeting, every quiet sacrifice was made in the name of a promise that someday, after all the work was done, you'd finally be free. Retirement was supposed to be that finish line, your golden reward, the place where life begins to feel like your own again. But what happens when that day arrives, and instead of freedom, you're met with silence? For many, the first weeks of retirement are filled with novelty, slow breakfasts, long walks, maybe even a long postponed vacation. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a quiet kind of emptiness begins to settle in. Without the structure of work, without the small affirmations of usefulness and identity, time stretches in unfamiliar ways. Days begin to feel weightless, not in a freeing sense, but in a drifting one. Because the truth is, freedom was never just about having time. It was about having a reason to wake up. And no one ever taught us how to find that reason once the calendar clears. This video isn't about tearing down the idea of retirement. It's about confronting the illusion that freedom automatically arrives once work ends. To truly understand why this phase of life can feel so disorienting, we first need to examine the cultural myth that shaped our expectations in the first place, the idea that retirement is the ultimate goal. For as long as most of us can remember, retirement has been sold as the dream. It appears in advertisements with smiling couples walking along sun-drenched beaches, holding hands as if nothing has ever weighed them down. Financial advisors talk about it as the finish line, the moment when the grind stops and life finally begins. We grow up with the narrative embedded in our minds. If we endure the pressure, delay gratification, and contribute faithfully to the system, we will be rewarded with freedom. But this vision, while comforting, is dangerously incomplete. It turns a life's journey into a transaction. Give your best years now, and you'll earn happiness later. And in doing so, it quietly postpones joy, growth, and meaning to a point in time that is both uncertain and, for many, unfamiliar when it finally arrives. Because freedom, in the way retirement promises it, is often defined by what is removed. No more schedules, no more obligations, no more demands. But when freedom is only about subtraction, about removing what we dislike, it leaves a void that's rarely filled. You may have time, but time without purpose can become a heavy thing. You may have space, but space without direction can feel hollow. What we're rarely told is that freedom isn't just the absence of work. It's the presence of something deeper, meaning, identity, and connection. The trap is that we imagine retirement as an endpoint when, in reality, it's simply a change in context. The world doesn't stop asking for your attention just because you stop working. Your mind still craves challenges. Your heart still longs for connection. And without something to anchor you, the very freedom you've longed for can start to feel like weightlessness, a kind of emotional drifting that no amount of leisure can fix. This disillusionment is often kept quiet. Few people want to admit that they feel more lost now than they did in the busiest years of their career. There's a subtle shame in saying, "I don't know what to do with my days," especially when you're supposed to be living your dream. And so, people keep smiling, keep traveling, keep filling calendars with activities, hoping that distraction might substitute for meaning. But the truth always finds its way in. Eventually, when the noise quiets, you're left with the undeniable question, if I'm not my job anymore, who am I now? That question, who am I now, rarely arrives with fanfare. It creeps in slowly, during the stillness of unstructured mornings or the empty stretch between small tasks. After a lifetime of motion, retirement offers a kind of stillness we aren't always prepared to hold. And what many discover, often to their own surprise, is that the hardest part of leaving work isn't financial, it's existential. To understand this fully, we need to step into the emotional terrain that retirement quietly unveils, the quiet shock of losing more than just a paycheck. The first days of retirement often feel like a reward. You sleep in without guilt, linger over coffee without glancing at the clock, and enjoy the novelty of unstructured time. It feels like a long exhale after years of being on edge, but soon, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, something quieter begins to take its place. A sense of unease that you can't quite explain. The days are yours, yet they feel strangely empty. You're free, and yet not at peace. For many, this shift happens in the smallest moments. The house is quiet at 10 a.m., and you catch yourself wondering if you're supposed to be somewhere. The phone doesn't ring as much anymore. Colleagues who once depended on you are moving on, building new rhythms without you. You find yourself drifting between tasks with no urgency, no clear endpoint, and no applause. At first, it feels like rest, but over time, rest with no recovery goal begins to feel like waiting. What you're experiencing isn't failure. It's not weakness. It's something psychologists refer to as a loss of structure, and it runs deep. For decades, your days were shaped by external forces, meetings, deadlines, expectations. These weren't just time fillers. They were subtle affirmations that your life had momentum, that you mattered in a tangible, measurable way. Without that scaffolding, many people begin to feel untethered. And then comes the emotional disorientation. You might feel guilt for not being more productive, guilt for not feeling happier. You might feel grief, not just for the career you left, but for the identity that was built around it. Work, for all its frustrations, gave you more than a paycheck. It gave you a place to be needed, a rhythm, a title. Without it, even simple questions like, "How are you spending your time these days?" can land like a small blow. This isn't just a personal crisis, it's a cultural silence. We prepare meticulously for the financial aspects of retirement, but rarely talk about the psychological ones. Retirement planning seminars teach you how to stretch your income, but rarely ask you to examine what will stretch your sense of meaning. So when the structure disappears, and the accolades fade, and you're left alone with your own thoughts, the silence can feel deafening. Some people rush to fill the void. They book cruises, volunteer, pick up hobbies, anything to avoid the ache of purposelessness. Others retreat inward, unsure of how to re-enter the world without their former identity. But eventually, most reach a point where activity for activity's sake begins to feel hollow. And that's when the real work begins. The inner search for something not external, not performative, but personal. Because what this quiet shock reveals isn't just the absence of work, it reveals the absence of inner anchoring. And if we're willing to face that discomfort head-on, it may also point us toward a deeper kind of freedom. When the routines fall away and the noise quiets, what remains is something more intimate, an encounter with the self, stripped of titles, tasks, and timelines. It's in this stillness that the meaning of freedom begins to shift, because the absence of structure, while disorienting at first, also holds the potential for clarity. But to find that clarity, we need to ask a different question. Not, what am I free from, but what am I free for? That's where real freedom begins to take shape, not as escape, but as alignment. For most of our lives, freedom is framed as an external condition. We imagine it as a lack of obligations, a surplus of time, and the power to choose without consequence. And in the context of retirement, this idea often takes the shape of leisure, long vacations, empty calendars, the ability to wake without an alarm. But if you sit with that version of freedom long enough, you begin to sense its limits, because freedom that is only external eventually becomes a shell, hollow, fragile, easily disturbed. Real freedom isn't about how many hours you control. It's about what anchors you when time is wide open. It's not about walking away from pressure. It's about walking towards something that resonates deeply with who you are. In that way, freedom is not found in the absence of demands, but in the presence of meaning. This kind of freedom, what we might call inner freedom, is rooted in self-understanding. It's the ability to be guided not by noise or novelty, but by a quiet clarity about what matters most to you now. When external identities fall away, what remains is your internal compass, and whether or not you've spent time cultivating it often determines how you navigate this next phase. Some discover this clarity through creative pursuits, painting, writing, gardening, not as hobbies, but as expressions of who they've always been beneath the deadlines. Others find it in relationships, not in a broad social circle, but in deep, intentional connections that nurture rather than distract. And many realize that freedom isn't static at all. It evolves, responding to the quiet shifts of aging, of letting go, of turning inward, But this kind of freedom also requires courage, because once you stop measuring your worth by productivity, you must find new ways to define fulfillment. That means letting go of comparisons, resisting the pressure to stay busy, and learning to listen to the subtler calls of your own soul. And that's not easy in a culture that often equates activity with value. The paradox is striking. The more we chase freedom as escape, the less grounded we feel. But when we begin to see freedom as a space for intentional living, a different picture emerges, one where time becomes a canvas, not a countdown, one where choice isn't about doing everything, but about choosing what aligns. In that way, real freedom is less about control and more about coherence. It's the moment you realize you're no longer living according to scripts written by others, but by the quiet truths you've unearthed yourself. And that kind of freedom doesn't require retirement at all. It just requires awareness. Recognizing what freedom truly means is only the beginning. Insight without action can still leave us adrift. What comes next is perhaps the most tender and powerful part of the journey, deciding how to live again. But this time, on your own terms. After years of running on inherited rhythms, retirement invites you not just to rest, but to rebuild. To ask, what kind of life do I want to create with the time I've been given? And more importantly, what do I want that life to stand for? Once the illusions of retirement fade and the deeper questions begin to surface, there's an opening, a quiet but profound opportunity to redesign how you live, not in a grand or performative way, but in a steady, intentional one. Because while the absence of structure can be disorienting, it also offers a rare kind of freedom, the freedom to choose, with clarity, what to carry forward and what to let go. Rebuilding a meaningful life after retirement doesn't require dramatic reinvention. It begins in the small, consistent choices that reflect what truly nourishes you. For some, this might look like revisiting long-forgotten passions, playing the piano not to perform, but to reconnect, learning to draw not for praise, but for presence. Others may find fulfillment in mentoring, offering their wisdom not from a pedestal, but from a place of shared humanity. There's something deeply grounding in being useful, not for productivity's sake, but for connection. Purpose doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to make money or fit neatly into a social box. Sometimes it's found in growing a garden, not just because it's peaceful, but because watching something bloom under your care reminds you that you're still part of the living world. Sometimes it's as simple as showing up consistently for someone else, a grandchild, a neighbor, a partner, and being a stable, quiet presence in their lives. Presence in But rebuilding isn't always easy. It takes courage to admit that you're starting from a blank page. It takes patience to unlearn the belief that value only comes from doing. And it takes trust to believe that even without titles or urgency, your presence matters. This process is often non-linear. You might try something that once brought you joy and feel nothing. You might volunteer and find that it drains more than it fills. That's okay. Building a meaningful life isn't about finding the answer. It's about learning how to listen again, how to pay attention to what brings you a sense of quiet aliveness. And slowly, as you begin to string together moments that feel like yours, the fog starts to lift. You may not return to the pace or clarity of your earlier years, but you don't need to. This chapter isn't about acceleration, it's about alignment. It's about living not by default, but by design. Not seeking constant stimulation, but finding meaning in rhythm, intention, and depth. Because when you rebuild life from the inside out, the days may still be quiet, but they are no longer empty. They begin to feel lived, rather than simply passed through. As the days take shape around new rhythms and quieter joys, something subtle but beautiful begins to happen. You stop chasing time and begin to befriend it, not as a threat or a dwindling resource, but as a companion that walks with you, not ahead of you. And in that shift, the final illusion begins to fade, the idea that life peaks before retirement. Because what time ultimately gives us is not just space, but the chance to live more deliberately within it. There's a quiet power in realizing that time, once feared as fleeting or overwhelming, can become a gift when it's no longer filled by force, but by choice. Retirement, in its most honest form, is not the end of relevance or motion. It's the beginning of a slower, deeper kind of becoming. The moments may be fewer in number than they once were, but they are fuller in depth, because they are no longer lived for approval or urgency. They are lived for truth. Time doesn't ask you to hurry anymore. It asks you to notice, to walk rather than run, to pause at the sound of birdsong, to write the letter you always meant to write, to sit with a friend in silence, knowing nothing needs to be said to feel seen. These are the riches of a life that's no longer measured by outcomes, but by presence. Of course, this chapter brings its own set of uncertainties: aging, impermanence, the quiet aches of change. But it also brings with it a gentler kind of wisdom. You begin to see life not as a ladder to climb, but as a landscape to walk through. And from this new vantage point, things you once overlooked now glimmer: the way morning light spills across a table, the joy of remembering a forgotten song, the comfort of being exactly where you are, without needing to go anywhere. This is the gift of time, not simply that you have more of it, but that you are no longer too distracted to see it for what it is: a space to live more fully, more attentively, more aligned with who you really are beneath the noise. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to understand that you don't have to wait until retirement to begin this kind of life. You can begin it now, in the small choices, in the slower mornings, in the deeper questions. Because in the end, freedom was never about having nothing to do. It was about having something worth doing, and the time and courage to do it well. If this video helped you see retirement or time itself in a new light, consider subscribing. I share reflections like this to help you reconnect with what truly matters, in the seasons of life that often go unspoken. And if you'd like to keep these gentle questions close, turn on the bell. That way, when the world gets loud, you'll know there's still a quiet space waiting for you here.